A woman came up to me on tour a few years ago and said, "You are a sexist pig." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because in Guts you have 3 boys being tortured and disemboweled. And if you believed in equal rights, then one of those boys would be a girl being disemboweled." And she was serious. So that's why Cannibal got written. And my editor said the second story I am not at all comfortable with is The Toad Prince. So The Toad Prince. Mona Gleason. Mona Gleason has this little tattoo of Mickey Mouse on her butt cheek. So Ethan decides to start with that. He kisses it and he says, "Imagine the first caveman whispering the words against her skin." And Mona says, "Don't." She says, "No tickling." But she doesn't turn over. Again, he kisses her mouse. And Ethan says, "Imagine a caveman getting poked with a burned stick. The soot sticking under his skin, and the caveman realizing this black spot is never going away." This is after Ethan's already tagged first, second, and third base. Mona's in his room, the two of them on his bed with one long afternoon before his folks get off work. It's been a battle to keep his blue jeans on. Mona's clothes are all over the place, her t-shirts and her skirt covering his desk, covering everything except for her. He has squeezed her titties and inched off her underpants. Her tattoo, it's someplace that her folks will never know it's there. That's the idea. Mona is so wet to go all the way. She is whimpering and dripping on his sheets, but Ethan doesn't want to repeat his recent past disasters. Unlike that first caveman, Ethan wants history to give him credit for his discovery. He puckers his lips and he sucks, giving Mickey Mouse a nasty purple face. He says, "Check it out. Hickey Mouse." Stretched out on her stomach, Mona twists around but still can't see, not without using a mirror. Ethan says, "Imagine that first caveman making his black spot bigger." Ethan describes the soot and a sharp shard of bone and somebody jabbing himself until he's covered in blood. How crazy that must have looked to the other cavemen. How what looks cool later on always looks really crazy at first. He pinches the Mickey Mouse skin and he says, "Imagine the first cave lady who poked an earring through her ear." He says, whatever it was, a fishbone or a cactus thorn, she didn't even know it was an earring. Mona giggles and she rubs him through his pants. He says, "You ladies, you aren't bulletproof anymore. You're all vaccinated against HPV and you've got a million ways to not get pregnant." Her eyes twitch back and forth between his crotch and his face. She wets her lips. Ethan describes the practice of pearling invented by natives of South Sea Islands. A native, he makes a little cut in the skin along the top of his penis. He plants a pearl just underneath that top layer of skin and he sews the cut closed. Probably he doesn't do this by himself. Probably it takes a whole football team of Tongans to hold him down while some witch doctor does it. But if it heals right, then they do it again. They bury pearls, a line of pearls all along the top of his dick. That way, when he's hard, those pearls, those hard little lumps, they bump up just right against the lady. Hearing this, Mona's rubbing, but not as hard. She looks at his pants and asks, Is that what you're not telling me? No, Ethan says. He lets her think that it's nothing that bad. The trick will be to get to the truth in little baby steps. From the tattoos to body piercing, next to pearling. After that, he describes saline inflation. How people, guys mostly, will make a little nick in the skin near the top of their scrotums. He stresses the plural, saying guys and saying scrotums, to make it sound less like the isolated pastime of a few perverted circus sideshow freaks. A guy inserts a sterile tube into this little nick, and he fills his scrotum with liters and liters of saline. A guy's sack swells to the size of a basketball, and he tapes the incision shut. Listening to this makes Mona quit hunting for his zipper. She looks a little green, but that's part of Ethan's plan. He explains ladies do it too to their breasts from underneath with a big needle like for giving blood. If it's breasts or a scrotum, it stays big for a couple days before the person's body absorbs all the water. I've seen pictures on the web, Ethan says. It makes your titties all big and pushed up together like a Victoria's Secret water bra, only without the bra. The image makes Mona cross her arms over her chest. Ethan chose her, not just because she's hot. He thought she'd be more open-minded, not like Amber Reynolds or Wendy Finerman. He'd found Mona Gleason in advanced placement microbiology during a section on virology. He loves her because she loves viruses. Theirs is a match made in heaven. Something stirs in his crotch like a baby ready to be born. He says, body modification. Every age embraces some fashion trend that looks ridiculous from any other point in history. Now he can tell that Mona feels two ways about getting into his pants. She's revved up, but all his talk has taken the edge off of her hot and horny. He says, he continues, the way I see it, a person has to sacrifice his life to something. He knows that she's put some empty bed between the two of them. Ethan says, have you ever heard of brothel sprouts? Mona says, Brussels sprouts? Ethan repeats slower. Brothel, he says, like a whorehouse. Now Mona looks wary. Her forehead wrinkles like she really doesn't want to connect the dots. He says, how about speed bumps? The worry lines disappear off her forehead. She nods. He asks, you do know corn on the cob? And Mona rolls her eyes, looking dopey with relief, and she says, of course. And Ethan shakes his head. He says, you don't have a clue what I'm talking about. He looks to make sure that the window is shut, the door is locked. He listens for the sound of anybody walking by within earshot. When he's sure that the coast is clear, he continues saying, that's what the streetwalkers call them. Hookers? Mona asks. Ethan holds up a finger to correct her. He says, prostitutes? Mona says, corn on the cob? Just listen, Ethan says. He describes going to the east side of town, sneaking out of the house and riding the bus over to the east side late at night. Other times on weekends, it was for research. It didn't cost very much. And hearing this, Mona makes a face like she knows where he's going. He says, I wore latex gloves. He says, to defend his methods, his scientific protocol. He describes how he stole sterile cotton swabs from the nurse's office at school and Petri dishes from the chemistry lab. He cultured the samples right on the desk, right here in his room. Mona looks at the desk, cluttered with books, textbooks on virology, no Petri dishes. She says, You had sex with prostitutes? And Ethan winces. No, he says, all I did was I swabbed them. To judge from her expression, Mona is picturing somebody mopping. Sailors swabbing a deck with mops and buckets of soapy water. To clarify, Ethan explains, I asked each subject about the history of her infection, how long ago it first manifested, how fast it had spread, questions about discomfort and any negative symptoms. The way Mona looks now, she is ready to find her clothes. To stall for time, to maybe calm her down, Ethan says, it's not what you think, he says, reassuringly. If you have been vaccinated, I promise you are not in any danger. Mona starts to reach off the bed. She's reaching for her phone, but Ethan reaches it first. He holds the phone away from her at arm's length while he reiterates, remember how crazy the man with the first tattoo must have looked? Mona's eyes stare back at his. Ethan's telling her this because he wants her to understand he's not a lunatic. It's not like he's a prude either. Some things he just needs to keep under wraps. He wants her to know what to expect when he drops his pants. He's an artist. He's a groundbreaking pioneer. He's telling her so she won't scream when she sees. He climbs to his feet, standing over her. He prompts, remember the first cave lady who put a bone through her nose? Now he's reaching for his belt, reaching to undo the buckle. He tosses her telephone over his shoulder. He flops open the belt. He doesn't want her to scream the way that Amber Reynolds screamed for help, or to dial 911 the way that Wendy Finerman tried. Ethan is the missing link that doesn't want to go missing. He says, I am what comes between human beings and what comes next. Mona's no longer revved up. But she's no coward either. She's a little hooked by curiosity. She backs into a crouch on the bed, her knees tucked under her. As Ethan stands there, she rakes the hair back from her face, her titties, the nipples have gone flat. He pops open the top button of his jeans. Ethan says, I'm not the first scientist to serve as my own guinea pig. As he pulls down the tab of his zipper, he can read Mona's expression. This isn't going very well. He has started so slow, making his case so gradually. But what she sees has wiped all the scientific rationality from her face. Her eyes go round, her mouth sags open. The only sound she makes is a tiny, jerking spasm of breath. My method, Ethan tries to explain, was to make tiny pinpricks and to infect each with a different sample. He struggles to stay reasonable and not react to the look on her face. He says, like in biology, he says hopefully, like Gregor Mendel and the peas. He says, I am my own test garden. This is how the first tattooed caveman must have felt. Or even Prince Albert. With everybody in his high school locker room staring, thinking that he's a crazy freak, not knowing that Prince Albert is a brilliant trendsetter, and a few years from now everybody will want the same deal. No, every stupid fucking football player probably gaped at Prince Albert the way that Mona is gaping with all the blood drained out of her cheeks. Despite how carefully he has prepared her, Mona does nothing but stare between Ethan's legs, mute. Her face freezes like a silent laugh as he tries to explain his scientific method. Like purling, like so many forms of body modification, his aim was to heighten sexual sensation. All the ladies are vaccinated, so what does it matter if a guy is infected? He's planted his test rows and watched to see what would sprout. The pinpricks weren't much. They were easier than a tattoo, less painful than a piercing. When the first results had burst from his skin, they made a track of little buds, cute almost, like old MacDonald's farm. Running the length of him was this delicate trail of tiny baby nubbins, too small to see except with a magnifying glass. When those little buds had started to grow, Ethan could see why they were called brothel sprouts. After all the rows were up and growing bigger, rows of bulbous little buds going all the way around his junk, then he understood why their other name was corn on the cob. Mona kneels at his feet, glancing at the window, at the locked door, and standing spread-legged, looming over her, Ethan says, from a scientific standpoint, you have to admit that they are fascinating. Some are red, others pink, bright pink drippings of flesh. Others look darker, lavender eruptions bursting from purple eruptions. A few are pale white, growing larger, telescoping outward. In microbiology, they'd studied how a virus was neither alive nor dead, not scientifically, not technically. Science wasn't sure what a virus was, other than a particle of nucleic acid coated in protein. It goes without saying that he has to sit now to take a leak. It's another safe bet that Mona's lady parts are all dried up. More and more these days, his dad tells him that he's just too smart for his own good. But this time he knows that that is not the case. Once he can perfect his process, then he'll patent it, or copyright it, or whatever, and it will make his family rich. Ethan has invented the one safe and effective way to grow and customize a guy's junk. The world will beat a path to his door. The problem is Ethan's garden has just kept growing. Even now, the garden is still swelling. No longer is it corn on the cob, it is fields of corn. It is not just a test garden, not anymore. It is a forest of nodes and nodules. Down there are clusters of warts so purple that they look almost black. Fat skin tags spring from sprouts and branch like tendrils until they form a jungle that hangs halfway to his knees. These hanging gardens, dangling between Ethan's legs, they look shaggy, bristling with bumps that drip from the backs of larger lumps that dangle from shapeless mounds of lank flesh. They form a tapering cluster of stalactites, slack and flopping tissue that hangs like a heavy curtain. Out of this rich fringe of aberrant cellular growth slowly descend ropey strings of seminal fluid, colorless as spider spit, which any motion or breath or thudding heartbeat set to gently pendulum from side to side. And somehow this drooling jungle, it can sense Mona. It smells her bare titties. It feels the heat of her skin, the same way that it had sensed Amber and Wendy. And it's growing, stealing all the blood that normally would go to Ethan's cerebral cortex. It's usurping his nervous system. And growing, it's becoming a beast that continues to flop out fleshy stalks and feelers until the rest of Ethan, the original Ethan, begins to wither and shrink. The beast expands, nodules blooming from warts, puffing up, ballooning from renegade spurts of inflating flesh. It expands with blood and lymph until all that remains of Ethan is a wadded, shrunken vestige perched midway down the red dappled, wart-pebbled back of the beast. It rears up over Mona. Foreign and mindless. Ethan is no more than a skin blemish sliding down to his ass. Ethan is no more than the hickey mouse is to Mona. The beast moves the way it's always moved, without muscles, without bones, the way a paramecium moves. By expanding itself in one direction across the bed, the beast moves with a peristaltic pushing out of trembling nodes, a hydraulic flooding and alternate drainage of cellular walls. It needs no skeleton to give it a shape, and doing so, it tumbles closer to her. By this far along, Ethan is almost asleep, neither alive nor dead. He can hardly speak because the beast has co-opted most of his blood. In a tiny voice, he says, "The worst thing you could do right now is panic." He reasons with her, wanting to explain sanely and logically about aesthetics, the cutting edge of culture and evolution, and whispering, he says, "You ladies aren't the only ones who can bring new life into the world." He is proof of that. At first, he was just a kid trying to grow his dick and get rich. And the next thing he knows, he is the gateway to a new dominant species. The problem is, he cannot accomplish this alone. He begs, if only Mona would just reach out and touch him. Pet it. Maybe even kiss it like the ugly toad in the fairy tale. Popular culture is chock full of monstrous things that grow out of ordinary, normal teenage boys. To Ethan's way of thinking, this isn't so different than what happened to Spider-Man. Mona Gleason can be his co-inventor. She could befriend it, and she could make the swelling go down. Between the two of them, they could maybe tame it. With just one kiss, he would turn back into her Prince Charming. The little bit that's left of Ethan is sucked dry, scrunched down to a pimple on the monster's ass, but he continues to listen for Mona's scream. Because after the scream, he knows that she'll try to escape, the same way that Amber and Wendy tried. And after he recovers, after he wakes up, he'll find Mona, like Amber, suffocated and bruised and everything else. And he'll have to stash her dead body in his closet before his folks get home from work. And then he'll have to go to school the next day and sit next to her empty desk. And in the afternoon, he'll have to rush home and bury her. He's almost certain the police and his parents would never understand. And once the hookers that he swagged, once they catch wind, they'll raise a ruckus and no one will ever get exclusive patent rights. Then, to make matters worse, he'll have to start all over again with a new girlfriend. It's then that Ethan feels something, a tickling, a tickle. In that moment, he feels something warm. It's the warm touch of fingers. As Mona reaches deep into the shuddering mess of tangled hairs and dangling flesh, and her lovely, soft lips close around the small, wet part of what's left of him.